Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon-free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. Saudi Arabia bundles power, capital, and chips for AI. Saudi Arabia is not abandoning incentives in its competition for AI infrastructure. It is going further, layering sovereign capital, infrastructure financing, and government-brokered chip access on top of them. Rather than waiting for a hyperscaler to select a site and negotiating tax terms afterward, Saudi Arabia is building a state-supported AI ecosystem meant to resolve several development risks at once. Its national AI company, Humane, is assembling financing, land, energy, data center capacity, processors, and networking equipment through a web of agreements involving Saudi institutions and major U.S. technology companies. None of this means every constraint is solved, or that Humane's full pipeline will be built. Many of the announced agreements remain preliminary, depend on customer commitments, or extend through the next decade. What they show is intent, assembling infrastructure ahead of confirmed global demand, rather than waiting for demand to justify the infrastructure. State-backed financing is moving ahead of full deployment. In January, Humane and Saudi Arabia's National Infrastructure Fund announced a non-binding financing framework of up to $1.2 billion, tied to as much as 250 megawatts of data center capacity. A framework is not a completed investment. The announcement does not mean the capital has been spent or that all 250 megawatts has entered construction, only that a financing structure exists as Humane secures customers and advances individual sites. That framework is one piece of a larger ambition. Humane has said it wants roughly 6 gigawatts of capacity by 2034, with some reporting placing the figure at 6.6 gigawatts, a scale that would require tens of billions of dollars in construction, power infrastructure, and equipment. In May, Reuters reported Humane had selected Goldman Sachs to advise on financing for a Riyadh area project that could cost at least 20 billion Saudi riyals, roughly $5.33 billion, tied to about 2 gigawatts of capacity, close to a third of the 2034 target. These are pipeline figures, not operating capacity, and they illustrate how directly Saudi public institutions are assembling capital around projects a private developer would normally finance only after securing firm demand. The STC and AMD Cisco ventures show where demand still matters. Humane's joint venture with Saudi telecom operator STC, through STC's digital infrastructure subsidiary Center 3, splits ownership 51-49 in Humane's favor and targets up to 1 gigawatt of AI-focused capacity, starting with an initial 250 megawatt phase that remains subject to contractual commitments from customers. That condition complicates any read of Saudi Arabia simply building capacity without regard to demand. State-linked companies are willing to plan at a scale few private developers could match, but customer contracts still determine when portions of the pipeline actually move forward. A separate Humane venture with AMD and Cisco follows the same logic, targeting an initial 100 megawatts using AMD's Instinct accelerators, scaling toward 1 gigawatt by 2030. That first 100 megawatts already has a named anchor customer, generative video company Luma AI, which contracted the full initial capacity before construction begins, combining state-backed development with the ordinary project finance principle that major capital follows contracted demand. Saudi Arabia is not skipping incentives. Saudi Arabia's model is additive, not a replacement for incentives. The kingdom's cloud computing special economic zone offers specialized tax treatment, regulatory and administrative support, and competitive electricity and network access to licensed operators, serving the same basic purpose as data center incentive programs elsewhere, lowering costs and reducing regulatory friction. The difference is what sits alongside those incentives. A U.S. state may exempt servers from sales tax or fast-track a local permit, but it does not typically create a national AI company, finance its infrastructure through a sovereign fund, negotiate semiconductor access through bilateral relations, and connect the resulting platform to domestic telecom and energy companies. Saudi Arabia is layering all of those mechanisms together. Incentives remain one component, but they are no longer the entire offer. Hardware access remains a government-level dependency. Saudi Arabia's buildout depends on advanced processors, still subject to U.S. export controls. NVIDIA announced plans in May 2025 to supply Humane with an initial 18,000 Blackwell processors as part of a relationship that could eventually reach hundreds of thousands of chips. And AMD separately committed to a $10 billion collaboration targeting 500 megawatts of AI computing capacity over 5 years. Qualcomm, Cisco, and AWS have each signed on for AI data centers, networking, and cloud infrastructure, respectively. Those arrangements go beyond ordinary equipment purchases into joint investment and infrastructure design, effectively assembling the AI supply chain inside one coordinated national strategy. But they do not eliminate U.S. oversight. Advanced chips remain subject to licensing conditions and access restrictions, meaning hardware stays a geopolitical dependency even when the data centers, energy, and financing sit entirely inside Saudi Arabia. Power and water are advantages, not solved problems. Saudi Arabia's abundant natural gas, low-cost electricity, and state-linked utilities give it an advantage over markets where developers wait years for an interconnection study or new substation. But an energy-rich national system is not the same as several gigawatts of deliverable power at completed sites. A 6-gigawatt portfolio would still require dedicated generation, substations, and transmission built to AI-grade reliability standards, and would represent a major new demand source. 6 gigawatts running continuously would consume roughly 52.6 terawatt-hours a year at full load, a theoretical ceiling rather than a forecast, but a useful illustration of scale. Desert climate adds a second unresolved variable. High ambient temperatures raise the energy cost of heat rejection. Evaporative cooling can cut electricity use but requires substantial water, and dry cooling saves water but uses more power and loses efficiency in extreme heat. Desalination could help, but carries its own electricity and infrastructure costs. The announcements so far do not provide enough site-level detail to determine the water intensity of Humane's planned portfolio, which remains a material unknown rather than evidence the projects cannot proceed. Those site-level resource constraints have derailed data center economics in far less arid markets than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are demonstrating a form of AI infrastructure competition only a limited number of governments can reproduce, deploying sovereign capital, coordinating state-linked utilities and telecoms, and treating data center development as national economic policy. The UAE has pursued a nearly identical sequencing strategy through its own state-linked entities, resolving power, capital, and chip access together before construction begins. U.S. and European markets, where utilities face independent regulation and governments have tighter limits on directing capital towards selected industries, can produce more competitive markets and stronger checks, but may move more slowly when transmission, permitting, and industrial policy all have to align. Saudi Arabia's strategy does not prove tax incentives have become irrelevant. U.S. states pursuing their own grid readiness-based incentive programs show the same logic applies domestically, just without a sovereign fund's ability to bundle financing and hardware access alongside it. For companies comparing Gulf sites against U.S. or European alternatives, the relevant question is no longer just the tax rate or electricity price, but how much of the full development stack, capital, power, chips, permitting, and customers, has already been assembled before a contract is signed. Sustainability Soundbites Energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's spotlight on energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.